Hi, my name is Randy Taylor-Toomay, and this is my analysis and review of Chapter 22 of the Critical Pedagogy Reader, titled Teacher Education and Democratic Schooling. An overview. So Chapter 22, Teacher Education and Democratic Schooling, is written by Henry A. Garreau. And the main idea and theme is that educational reform must begin with our teacher education system. There's a lot of talk right now about the changes in education, including moving to the Common Core curriculum and different things that are going to help our schools, but there's a good, strong argument out there that the teacher education system also needs to change along with our regular schooling system. So this chapter goes into those ideas and how we can get to that point. So first I want to learn a little bit about the author. I've created a glogster that sort of talks about the author a little bit and his main ideas as a critical pedagogue and his different researches. So let's check that out. So Henry A. Garreau, who is he? He's an American scholar and cultural critic who vigorously opposes neoliberalism. He's an advocate of radical democracy. His recent works focus on the public pedagogy, and he's named in the top 50 of educational thinkers. He believes that teachers must work across all pedagogical domains and that teachers are public intellectuals. He believes American youth is exploited and manipulated and believes in democratic reform and is against religious fundamentalism. A famous quote from him is that collective freedom is one devoid of material bondage and is one that supports the institutions necessary for democracy. Next to that quote, we have a picture, a cartoonist picture of Henry A. Garreau, and basically he's one of the leading thinkers in reform for American schools. So throughout this chapter, he talks about his own works along with his works with other authors and other authors' works on the subject. The main points that he covers in this chapter are the current climate of teacher education, the new conservative education reform, teachers becoming transformative intellectuals, the American democracy crisis, teacher education, democracy and the imperative of social reform, public schools as democratic social spheres, rethinking the nature of teacher education as cultural politics, power, language, history, and culture in teacher education, and lastly, what it all means for our students. So the current climate, that's basically talking about what teacher education is as of now. The education system that most of the teachers teaching in American schools have gone through and the one that teacher ed students are currently going through. He starts with a quote from Horace Willard in 1890 that says, "Teachers live lives of mechanical routine and were subject to a machine of supervision, organization, classification, grading, percentages, uniformity, promotions, tests, and examinations." The interesting thing that is good to point out about this quote is that this is the way teacher education and teaching have become in modern times. It's constantly about teaching to the test. You're supervised. It's all about your organization skills, grading, percentages, and so on. He goes on to say that there is no room for individuality, ideas, independence, originality, study, and investigation. Which is what this whole chapter is about getting towards. We want to get towards individuality, ideas, independence, originality, study, and investigation in our classrooms. That way we can teach that to our students. This section also discusses that teacher education programs don't have much concern for citizenship and democracy in the classrooms. We'll get more into that in a later section. So fairly quickly, the author goes in to talk about the term a new conservative. A new conservative is conservatives and liberals joining together, calling themselves new conservatives, to have a different name in their educational reform. This educational reform that they're promoting is shifting away from equity and justice, and it's leaning towards elite corporation, industrial, and military cultural interests. There's little focus on how reforming of the education system could better serve the interests of diverse groups of students. The educational reform that they're promoting is pretty much synonymous with turning schools into testing centers. It's all about testing, no child left behind style of educational reform. Again, leaving teachers out of the control of what's happening in their classrooms and what they are allowed to teach and what they are to teach. It's coming from someone else outside of the classroom, and it's put down to the teacher to teach to the students. The next point that the author goes over is his term of transformative intellectual. He describes it as one who exercises forms of intellectual and pedagogical practice that attempt to insert teaching and learning directly into the political sphere by arguing that school is both a struggle for meaning and a struggle over power relations. He also goes on to say that a transformative intellectual refers to one whose intellectual practices are necessarily grounded in forms of moral and ethical disclosure, exhibiting a preferential concern for the suffering and struggles of the disadvantaged and oppressed. His idea here is that if in teacher education we can begin to teach the students to be transformative intellectuals, they'll begin to value the disadvantages of the oppressed, and they'll seek meaning and power in their classrooms morally and ethically, then shifting the climate in the classroom to become more of a social justice classroom rather than just drill and kill and understanding tangible knowledges. A lot of the current literature and research on education reform points to a bigger overlying theme that the American democracy is in crisis itself, and that our education system is a direct reflection of how poorly our democracy is running. The teachers raised in our system are teaching the way they were taught, and that's to be powerless and passive and to regurgitate information. The author begins to break down steps into moving towards a better teacher education system, the first being teacher education, democracy, and the imperatives of social reform. The real reform of teacher education the real reform of the education system is going to come from the teacher education. The students are going to listen to the teachers do what they're told in their teacher education programs. So if we can change the teacher education program, the teachers will change the way they're teaching, and the students will thus change the way they're learning. We should be teaching in teacher education critical terminology and language used in teacher education. Teachers need to be provided with conceptual apparatuses, and teachers need to understand and weigh the question of, is school for the society or is society for the school? These things can be reciprocated down to the students in their own classroom if it's taught and learned correctly. A large focus of this section is on the language used in teacher education, and that's to say that we need to start hearing the terms critical pedagogy and reform and social justice used more in our classrooms so that the students understand what that means and how that can be used in their classrooms and in their lives outside of the school. A large part of the problem of the teacher education system as it is what are we teaching is the purpose of public schooling. Right now, the attitude is that the purpose of public schooling is to make better workers. That's where we see the problem coming to fruition. We need to teach our students to be more than workers. The students need to be social advocates and serve their communities in more ways than just labor. Interjecting the culture of politics into the classroom needs to become less taboo and more of a norm so that students are unafraid of voting in the climate of their government when they leave the high school system. If the teachers are dedicated to self and social empowerment, they'll be able to model that for their students and encourage their students to become empowered. They also will be having skills created for critical democracy. If that critical democracy is a classroom setting, the students are used to expecting that and can expect that and demand that when they leave the classroom. Rethinking the nature of teacher education. Should it be abolished altogether? The author argues that many people are thinking, let's abolish the teacher education system and come up with a whole nother way of choosing teachers in our society. This is not the answer. There are good parts of the teacher education system. It just needs to be adjusted so that teachers know the essential components of becoming a teacher are more than just knowing the disciplinary knowledge of what they're teaching. They need to be able to theorize in a different educational language. They need to understand the hidden curriculum and what happens in a real classroom, along with the sociology of teaching. The things they need to know stretch far beyond how well they know the discipline they will be teaching in. The next step to reforming teacher education is in cultural politics. We need to reconstitute the grounds upon which teacher education programs are built, make them less academic drilling and more about the hidden curriculum. Understand that the teachers choosing to become a teacher in their discipline know that discipline very well. What they may not know is the real issues and things that come about in a classroom. Teachers need to learn to be empowering and to teach the students to be empowered. They need to understand the process of appreciating and loving oneself. The largest section discussed in this chapter is power, language, history, and culture in teacher education. These are things that are not generally heard in teacher education unless you are a history teacher or a language teacher or a cultural studies teacher. But it's argued that these subjects should be taught for the teacher education program as a whole. Beginning with power in teacher education and the tie between power and knowledge. Many teachers fear power and feel that it's a bad thing to have, but they need to understand that having that power is being able to convey to the kids what the knowledge is that they have, and understanding the connection between knowledge and power as an educator makes you become more effective. Knowledge in teacher education is something that is usually thought of something you can be mastered. I can master the knowledge of a certain subject, but it should be taught as more of something that is endless, and the more knowledge you have, the more power you have. The language currently used in classrooms is a white, middle-class, male language, and for many of our students that's unrelatable and is biased and oppressing them further. It's forcing a perspective onto the students that doesn't make sense to their culture and their self. It's a concept of the world given through a language they don't quite understand. Although it's English, it's a different way of conveying knowledge. It leaves out traditions and variances that may have come from their style of language and their culture. Injecting history into teacher education is a very important part of this reform idea. The idea says that history should be part of all teacher education. It can open up cultural understanding, and it can include women, minority groups, and indigenous peoples, which will then open up more and more history books and teach the students on another level. It forms traditions and ideas and makes the world what it is today, and too much focus is on just for the history teachers instead of how history is injected into all subjects across the curriculum.